As Nneka was coming into her room, she saw a strange woman wearing a white garment standing inside her room, and before her very eyes, the ghost woman disappeared. Nneka was not able to see well again. Her head became so blown and chills ran down her spine. She was terrified by what she saw. She fainted and once upon a time, there was a man named Kano. Kano was married to Nneka. Kano and her wife lived in a town called Agwo, where he worked as a cashier in a local bank. One day, Kano was sent on a transfer to another city, far away from the city they lived. Kano embarked on this journey alongside her wife, Nneka. They relocated to a neighboring city called Ide Town. When they got to Ide Town, they were stranded. They had nowhere to stay or lay their head. Since they just arrived in the city, they decided to stay in a hotel room before getting an apartment. They stayed in a hotel room for 3 weeks, and on the 4th week, they ran short of funds. The agent that was meant to find them a house was busy postponing the house hunt. He kept asking them for more money. The more money they gave him, the more excuses he gave them. Kano and his wife Nneka could not take it any longer. They decided to go on a house hunt by themselves. They searched for 2 weeks but couldn't find any. The houses they saw were expensive and way more than what they had. Finally, on the 3rd week, they started the house hunt. Out of desperation, they saw a house which they thought was cheaper. They decided to rent the house. On the day they went to check up on the house, Nneka noticed something strange about the house. Nneka asked her husband,
"Did you notice anything strange about this house?"
Her husband replied her saying,
"Everything seems normal to me. I don't notice anything strange at all. Everything looks normal."
Nneka replied his husband,
"This house looks strange and chilling. No one lives around here. There is no one living in the compound, and also the next apartment is empty."
She also noticed the building looks like a deserted place. The compound seems cold and chilling with a kind of negative energy. Nneka said to herself,
"It looks strange though, but since we are desperate for a house now, we are going to proceed living here. Maybe we can decide to rent a better apartment when we have settled."
Nneka and her husband were so happy they finally got an apartment. They paid for the house rent and moved into the house. Everything seems to look normal and was going on fine until after a month. One night, around 11 p.m., that night, as Nneka and her husband were getting ready to go to bed for that day, they heard a very creepy sound and laughter from the kitchen. They were surprised and was so anxious to know where such sound was coming from. They ran to their kitchen and looked around, but they saw no one there. Nneka and her husband was frightened. They couldn't understand who was laughing. They went back to their bed scared. The next morning, everything was normal again. Kano left for his working place while Nneka, his wife, was sitting at the sitting room. Suddenly, she began to hear some strange noise again. This time, she was the only one at home. She heard the strange whispers from her bedroom. She was so scared at first. She wanted to run away outside the house, but she decided to summon on courage. She came into her bedroom, looking around. She asked,
"Who are you and what do you want from my family?"
But no one replied. Nneka decided to go back to her sitting room, but the strange and dreadful noises persisted. She became too scared to stay indoors. Rather, she ran away from home, waiting outside for her husband to get home. When Kano got home, he met his wife standing outside He asked her.
Why are you standing outside?
Nneka replied,
I have to run for my dear life. I keep hearing those strange noise inside.
She narrated all the events that has happened when he was away. This made Kanu so worried and uncomfortable. As the day passed into weeks, this ugly situation began to get worse. They began to notice strange sounds inside the house, especially at night. They could hear a strange noise from the kitchen. Most times, it sounds like footsteps moving about the house. Sometimes, they hear a strange laugh. At times, they hear people whispering. But each time they check or look around the house, they find or see no one. This made Nneka so scared that she began to persuade her husband to start looking for another apartment. Nneka said to her husband,
I think it's time we look for another apartment. I can't stay here any longer.
But her husband replied her saying,
The problem is not looking for another apartment. The problem is the fund. We are short of fund. We can't even afford to pay for another apartment elsewhere. We just paid for a 6 months advance for this house. Where else can we find money to relocate?
He said to his wife. But the wife was still displeased. After 2 months living in the mysterious house, things began to get worse. One day, as Nneka was coming into her room, she saw a strange woman wearing a white garment standing inside her room, and before her very eyes, the ghost woman disappeared. Nneka was not able to see well again. Her head became so blown and chills ran down her spine. She was terrified by what she saw. She fainted and became unconscious. When her husband got home, he found out that her wife was nowhere to be found. He looked around the house. As he steps into his bedroom, he found his wife looking very unconscious. After Nneka regained consciousness, she told her husband that she was leaving the house.
There is so much evil spirit in this house. I can't stay here any longer. I am leaving this house today. I can't continue like this. Even if it means sleeping on the street, it's better, but I just need to get out of this house immediately.
Her husband replied her saying,
Don't go. I think I have a solution to this. Let's invite a spiritual cleric to pray for us. I believe after his prayer, all this will cease to happen.
Kanu was able to convince his wife, and she stayed back. The next day, they invited a cleric who prayed for their home and blessed their home. And after he left, they were happy and thought everything was okay, but they never knew that was the beginning of their problem. After 2 days, such events never occurred again. It looks like everything has begun to look normal and they were happy again and were comfortable living in their home. One evening, as Nneka stepped into the room to shower, she saw another strange looking woman wearing black standing inside her bathroom. Nneka couldn't help but run for her life. She ran outside screaming for help. Each time such event happens, she always waits outside until her husband comes back home before she could go back inside the house. But one night, as her husband Kano traveled for an outside walk, Nneka was left home all alone. That night, as she stepped into her kitchen to get something to eat, this time she saw a young female ghost standing and looking at her. She decided not to be afraid of the ghost. She summoned courage and asked the ghost a question.
Who are you and what do you want from my house?
The ghost replied,
This is my house. I lived here before you came in. No one can take my place. This house belongs to me.
Nneka told her,
I command you to leave this minute. Leave my house now.
But the ghost laughed a wicked laugh and disappeared. One morning, Nneka discovered she was pregnant. and was expecting a baby. She was excited and broke the good news to her husband, who was overexcited. 3 weeks into her pregnancy, Nneka began to feel strange. She felt so weak and she decided to rest a while. As she laid down on her bed to take a little rest, she slept off and had a very terrible dream. Woke up. She then realized it was just a dream and was so scared. She didn't bother about the dream to went on with her daily duty. The next day, she became so sick that she can hardly move. But the sickness resulted in her having a miscarriage and she lost the pregnancy. Nneka couldn't stop weeping, but she was consoled by her husband. After 2 weeks, something very bad and unusual happened. On a fateful Monday morning, her husband lost his job. He was sacked from his job, which was their only means of survival. When her husband broke this news to her, when Nneka heard that her husband has lost his job, she became so scared and unhappy. She kept asking God,
Why? Why now? What is happening? Oh my God.
She cried so much like she was mourning. She became very unhappy. As time goes on, things went really bad for them. Things became very difficult for them. They hardly eat a square meal a day. Nneka decided to start looking for a job. She searched for a job, but no company was willing to employ her. She decided to borrow some money from a friend to start a petty trade. She started selling some fruits and vegetables in the market, not very far away from her house. Everything was going well and she was able to make some money for she and her husband. After 3 weeks into the business, her husband became critically ill. Nneka became devastated. She used the savings and the money she made from her trade to pay for her husband's hospital bill. After her husband was discharged from the hospital, things became really hard for Nneka. She had no money or business. There was no food in the house for her and her husband. Things became so terrible for them and they began to wonder what actually went wrong. Nneka said to herself,
What happened? How did things become so bad for us? Things are not this hard for us before, but why are things getting so difficult? Eating a full meal is now a very big problem. I can hardly lay hands on money, unlike before. I buy whatever I want, but right now, my husband and I can't even afford a full square meal. God, where do I go from here?
Nneka started growing concerned over the house they lived in. She was sure there was something strange about the house, so she decided to ask questions concerning the house. When she began asking questions about the house they live in, she met an old woman who lived in the same street as her. After greeting her, she asked her,
Please, I want to ask you a question.
The old woman said. Nneka asked
Are
her,
there people who have lived in the same house before we came in?
Yes, there has been people who lived there, but the man who first lived there died in his sleep, and he never woke up again. The second tenant left 3 weeks after he packed in.
It was then Nneka discovered that her suspicion about the house was actually true. The woman went as far as telling her the secret behind the house. She
My
told
daughter,
her,
I would advise you to leave the house as soon as possible. People who live in that house dies a mysterious death. They pack into the house rich, but they pack out very poor. Please, you and your husband should leave as soon as possible. The house you live was built on a graveyard.
Nneka became so scared and surprised to hear this.
Do
She
you know
asked,
the place we live is on a graveyard?
Yes, it is on a graveyard. People who died were normally buried there. But all of a sudden, the land was sold and the apartment you lived was built on it shortly.
This got Nneka screaming. She hurriedly went back home, narrated the whole event to her husband. Her husband couldn't believe his ear. That night, they couldn't sleep. Kanu began planning how they could evacuate the house. But there was no money. He called his family and friends, but no one was willing to extend a helping hand to them. Everyone came up with an excuse. They were stuck in the haunted house with no money or hope to rent a new apartment. Few days later, Kanu became very sick for the second time. This time around, it was so severe. Nneka had a dream. In her dream, she saw her husband standing and his soul leaving his body. Nneka was crying. She also woke up crying. Nneka was so confused that she didn't know what next to do. There was no money to take him to the hospital, and all the over-the-counter drugs they bought were not working. Nneka went back to the same old woman she met before, who lives along the same street with her. She said,
Mama, my husband has been sick for the past few days, and I have used all the money I have to get him drugs. Please, can you lend me some money to get him to the hospital? I love my husband and I don't want him dead.
The old woman replied her,
I can assure you that drug is not what your husband needs. Now, you need to leave that house as soon as possible.
Nneka replied to the old woman,
I have nowhere to take my husband to, not even money. I have nothing.
The old woman replied her saying,
Try as much as possible to get him out of that house before it is too late.
Nneka knew that if she kept staying in the house with her husband, she might lose her husband. She hurried back home and decided to pack her bags and that of her husband and then left the house. She and her husband decided to stay at an uncompleted building behind the same street they lived. After 2 days of staying at the uncompleted building, Kanu began to gradually regain his health. He became healthy again. Nneka was so excited that her husband was reviving. After 2 weeks of staying at the uncompleted building, friends who refused to help them at first began to reach out to them. Some offered them a lot of money. They decided to rent a new apartment, leaving the haunted apartment. They started from small again. Nneka started a new petty trade at the nearby market. She began to make so much sales and she made a sustainable amount of money. And they were able to feed well again. After 2 months, the husband was called back to his job and everything began to move well again for them.